The mist does not rise from the ground, it descends from the sky. It is a slow, deliberate suffocation. A gray shroud that unspools from the treetops of the Blackwood Forest and crawls across the fields like the fingers of a dying man. It is the first thing you would notice if you were to visit the forgotten duchy of Ashwood, that the air itself seems to be mourning something. And it is in this air, heavy with the scent of damp earth and old rot, that the story you are about to hear was born. It is the story of a man who sought to bury his shame in the countryside, only to discover that the land he discarded his wife upon had a hunger that would not be sated. A hunger that would warp flesh, memory, and time itself. It is the story of Duke Alistair Vane and the village that became his eternal nightmare. The year was 1786. The Enlightenment was spreading its thin, rational light across Europe, promising that the world could be understood, catalogued, and conquered. But in the remote corners of the continent, where the old maps still marked the land as terra incognita, the shadows of the ancient world clung to the soil with stubborn tenacity. The Duchy of Ashwood was one such place. Tucked between a jagged spine of mountains and a sea that was perpetually gray, it was a land that seemed to have been designed for exile. The soil was thin and bitter, yielding crops that tasted of sorrow. The people were gaunt, their faces carved from weathered stone, their eyes holding the flat, patient gaze of those who have seen too many winters. It was to this land that Duke Alistair Vane banished his wife, the Lady Elara. The Duke himself was a man of the city, a creature of gilded ballrooms and the sharp, cutthroat politics of the royal court. His reputation was as polished as his silver-tongued words, but the gloss was beginning to chip. He was a gambler, not just with cards, but with alliances, and his debts, both financial and moral, were beginning to mount. He had married Elara for her family's connections, but the connections had soared, and Elara, once a beautiful pawn, had become a reminder of his failures. She was clever, perhaps too clever, and her quiet, observant nature was a mirror that reflected the Duke's own hollow core. The final straw was a scandal, a whisper, a rumor about her fidelity that he himself had likely fabricated to give him an excuse. He needed her gone, not dead, not yet, but absent. A wife in the country was a wife out of sight, and for a man like Alistair Vane, out of sight was the only way to be out of mind. The banishment was delivered not in a fit of rage, but with the chilling precision of a business transaction. The Duke's study in his London townhouse was a monument to his vanity, all dark mahogany and the scent of expensive leather. He did not look at her as he spoke. He looked instead at the paper on his desk, the deed to the Ashwood estate, as if the land itself was a billet of sale. "You will leave for Ashwood at dawn," he said, his voice devoid of the warmth that had once faked during their courtship. "The estate is remote, but it is sufficient. You will have a small staff, a modest allowance, and all the solitude you seem to crave." Elara, who had been standing by the window, did not weep. She did not plead. She merely turned and looked at him, and for a fleeting second, the Duke felt a sliver of something cold and sharp slide between his ribs. It was not sorrow he saw in her eyes. It was a terrible, quiet acknowledgement, as if she had been expecting this, as if she had seen this moment in her dreams for years. She did not speak, but her lips moved silently, forming a single word that he could not decipher. He chose to interpret it as a curse. He would later learn that it was far, far worse than that. It was a promise. The journey to Ashwood took 3 weeks. The roads grew worse the further they traveled from the capital, devolving from cobbled thoroughfares into mud-choked tracks that wound through forests so dark they seemed to swallow the daylight. Elara traveled in a coach that was more cage than carriage, its windows rattling with every jolt, the leather curtains drawn tight against a world she did not wish to see. She did not speak to the servants who accompanied her, a tired, older woman named Greta and a stoic coachman whose name she never learned. She spent the journey in a state of silent preparation, her mind turning inward. Weaving a web of plans and defenses. She knew what Alistair intended. He wanted her to wither. He wanted her to fade into obscurity, to become a ghost story whispered about in the capital, a sad footnote in his rise to power. He was not the first man to try such a thing, but Elara was not the first woman to be underestimated. The Ashwood estate was revealed to her in the dying light of a late autumn afternoon. The sky was a bruised purple, and the clouds hung low and fat with a chill that promised a bitter winter. As the coach crested the final hill, the village of Ashwood unfolded below it. A scattering of thatch-roofed hovels clustered around a crooked church steeple. Beyond it, on a slight rise, stood the manor house. It was a grim, unlovely structure of gray stone, built in a style that was centuries out of date, its windows like the dark, empty eye sockets of a skull. The land around it was a patchwork of dying fields, the hedgerows choked with brambles. It was a place that seemed to exhale a perpetual sigh of defeat. Greta, the companion, shifted uncomfortably, clutching a small crucifix that hung around her neck. The air was wrong. It was not the crisp, clean air of the countryside she had known as a child. It was thick, almost syrupy, carrying a faint undertone of iron, like the smell of an old wound. Elara, however, stepped from the coach with a surprising lightness. She paused, her boots sinking slightly into the damp earth, and drew a long, slow breath. For a moment, a flicker of something that might have been pain crossed her features, but it was swiftly replaced by a mask of absolute calm. She was not afraid. She was angry, yes, and deeply wounded, but fear had fled her heart a long time ago. She had come to this desolate place with nothing but the clothes on her back and a small, intricately carved wooden box that she carried with her everywhere. She had not allowed the servants to touch it. It was the only thing she owned that the Duke had not been able to take from her. The people of the village, drawn by the unusual sight of a carriage, had gathered at the edges of the lane. They were a silent, watchful herd. Their faces pale and gaunt, they did not bow, they did not smile, they simply stared at the new arrival, and Elara felt the weight of their gaze, a collective, silent interrogation. She met their eyes, one by one, and in that meeting a silent contract was formed. She had come here to be forgotten, but she would not be ignored. The days that followed were filled with the mundane business of survival. The manor was in a state of terrible disrepair. Cobwebs hung from every corner like dusty shrouds. The furniture was rotting and infested with woodworm, and the windows were so grimy that the light struggled to penetrate. The servants the Duke had provided were, unsurprisingly, the dregs, a sullen cook who had been dismissed from 3 other households for theft, and a pair of scullery maids who were more interested in gossip than work. Greta, the one loyal soul, did her best to create some semblance of order, but the task was Sisyphine. The house seemed to resist them. Doors that had been opened would be found closed again moments later. They would hear footsteps in the corridors only to find them empty. The cook swore he saw a face peering at him from the pantry window, a face that vanished as soon as he turned. Elara, however, did not seem to notice the house's hostility. Or perhaps she simply chose to ignore it. She had brought a small library of books with her, and she spent her days reading and writing in her journal, her pen scratching across the page with a furious intensity. She began to take walks, long, meandering walks through the village and across the barren fields. She was not content to remain imprisoned within the manor's stone walls. The villagers watched her with their suspicious, silent stares, but she did not flinch. She began to learn their names. She listened to their stories of failed harvests, of sickly children of a land that seemed to be slowly dying. The soil was sour, the elders told her. It had been sour for generations. Nothing they did could fix it. The priests had blessed the fields, the elders had performed the ancient rites, but the earth remained barren. It was as if the land itself was cursed, its very lifeblood poisoned by something that had happened long before anyone could remember. One afternoon, Elara walked to the edge of the Blackwood Forest. It was a place the villagers avoided, a place they spoke of in low, hushed tones. They called it the Tangle, a name that spoke of its wild, chaotic nature. It was not a forest of majestic oaks and dappled sunlight. It was a forest of twisted, gnarled trees, their branches reaching out like skeletal arms, their bark covered in a sickly green moss. The air at its edge was noticeably colder, and the silence was absolute. There was no birdsong, no rustle of animals in the undergrowth. It was a dead zone. Elara stood at the threshold, her hand resting on the rough bark of a boundary tree, and she felt it, a pull. A strange magnetic force urging her forward. She took a step, then another. The ground beneath her feet was spongy, decomposing, releasing a sweet, cloying odor that made her head swim. She walked for perhaps 100 feet, following a path that was barely discernible, until she came to a clearing, and in the center of the clearing she found it. A circle of stones. They were not the towering monoliths of ancient temples, but smaller, more subtle stones. Their surfaces worn smooth by wind and rain, arranged in a perfect circle about 12 feet in diameter. On the ground in the center of the circle, the earth was different. It was dark, almost black, and it was barren of leaves or grass. It was just earth, and it looked wet, as if something had been spilled there and absorbed. Elara felt her heart beat a rapid, staccato rhythm against her ribs. She did not know what this place was, but her soul recognized it. It was a place of power, a place where the veil between worlds was thin, a place where whispers could become shouts and shadows could take shape. It was, she would later come to understand, the heart of Ashwood, and the heart was wounded. She began to visit the circle every day. She would take her journal and sit on one of the stones, her back to the twisted trees, and she would write. Her words began to change. Initially, they were filled with bitterness, a chronicle of Alistair's betrayal, her own humiliation. But as the weeks passed, her writing became more abstract, more poetic. She began to write about the land itself. She wrote about the dreams she was having, vivid, terrifying dreams in which she was a tree, her roots sinking deep into the cold earth, drinking up a terrible sorrow. She dreamed of figures in the forest, figures that were not quite human, their faces shifting like the surface of a pond, their voices a chorus of murmurs that she could almost understand. She started to feel a kinship with the land of Ashwood. It was a sort of cold comfort. The land was as miserable as she was. The land was also waiting for something to change, for the long winter to end. And as Elara sat in that circle of stones, a dangerous idea began to germinate in her mind. What if she could be the one to change it? What if she could make Ashwood into something beautiful? What if she could take this barren, miserable place and transform it into a garden? The plan, at first, seemed to come from a place of desperate hope. She began to write to the Duke, not with pleas, but with requests. She needed seeds. She needed tools. She needed soil amendments. Her letters were polite, businesslike, devoid of any emotion. The Duke, surprised by her apparent resignation, was only too happy to grant her requests. To fund her little projects, he wrote back dismissive replies, telling her to do as she pleased, that it mattered little what she planted. The land was cursed and would bear nothing. He was wrong. In the spring of 1787, Elara planted her first garden. She planted tulips and roses, vegetables and herbs, all brought from the capital at great expense. The gardener she had managed to coax from a neighboring town planted them with the cynical expertise of a man who knew what the soil would do. And for the first few weeks, it seemed his cynicism was justified. The plants wilted, they shriveled, they turned a sickly yellow and died. But Elara was not defeated. She spent nights in the manor's library, poring over old books on agriculture. She spoke to the oldest villagers, the ones who still remembered the old songs and the old methods. She learned about the festival of the first planting, a pagan tradition that had been banned by the church centuries ago. And she learned about blood. The old men told her in whispers that their grandfathers had spoken of a time when the soil was fertile, a time when the harvests were so bountiful that Ashwood was a place of plenty. The soil wasn't always sower, they said. It was a punishment for a crime so terrible that the land itself had been wounded. Elara listened, and she began to understand. The land needed a sacrifice, a fair trade. She could not just take, she had to give. The next time she planted, she did so in the dead of night. She went to the clearing in the Blackwood Forest, the circle of stones, and she took the small, intricately carved wooden box she had carried with her from the capital. She opened it. Inside was not jewels or gold, but a single, simple thing, a lock of hair. Her own hair, cut on her wedding day. She held it in her hand, the fine copper strands catching the faint moonlight, and she whispered a prayer. It was not a prayer to God. It was not a prayer to the devil. It was a prayer to the land itself. A plea for rebirth. She took the lock of hair and buried it in the center of the stone circle, pressing it deep into the cold, damp earth. She said the words the old men had taught her, words that were older than the church, older than the village, older even than the trees. She sang a song that sounded like the wind howling through a ravine, and as she sang, she felt a vibration in the ground, a tremor that was not of her own making. The roots of the trees in the forest seemed to writhe. The mist began to thicken, to close in around her, and in the mist, She saw shadows dancing. There were no voices, but she heard the whispers in her mind. It was a language she did not speak, but she understood. It was a bargain. The land would give her what she wanted, but the price would be steep. It would demand payment in full. The morning after the ritual, the gardener came to Elara, his face pale, his eyes wide. The wilted plants had not just recovered. They had exploded with growth. The roses were as large as dinner plates, their scent a heavy, cloying sweetness that filled the air. The vegetables were enormous, swelling with a juice that was too sweet, too perfect. It was a miracle. The gardener had no explanation. He crossed himself and mumbled a prayer. Refusing to look Elara in the eye, he knew perhaps instinctively that this was not the work of God. This was something else, something that had been awakened. Elara, however, was pleased. She had done it. She had forced the land to yield. She had proven Alistair wrong. She wrote to him again, describing the miracle in the garden. She told him how she had transformed the barren soil into a paradise, the first of its kind in the region. The Duke, of course, was incredulous. It must be a trick, a lie. He had to see it for himself. His arrival at Ashwood was not one of reconciliation. It was one of inspection. He rode into the village with a retinue of his sycophantic friends, men who laughed at his jokes and repeated his opinions. He was not prepared for what he found. The village of Ashwood, which had been a pit of despair, had indeed been transformed. The houses had been painted, the thatch repaired. The fields were bursting with crops of a fantastic size and quality. The people, though still gaunt, had a new light in their eyes, a desperate, nervous hope. And there, standing on the manor's front steps, was Elara. She was not the ghost he had left behind. She was radiant, her figure fuller, her hair now a striking silver blonde, her eyes a shade of green, so vivid they seemed to glow. She was wearing a dress of forest green velvet that was far too expensive for her allowance. There was an air of regal authority about her that made the Duke stop in his tracks. She did not curtsy. She smiled. "Welcome home, Alistair," she said, her voice a soft, musical purr. "I trust your journey was pleasant. Please, come see what I have made of your gift." The Duke was a man who prided himself on his immunity to charisma, but the moment he walked into the manor's gardens, he felt something shift inside him. The sight was breathtaking, but it was a terrible, unsettling beauty. The flowers were too brilliant, their colors too vivid, bleeding into shades that did not exist in nature. The hedges were unnaturally symmetrical, carved into shapes that seemed to writhe when you weren't looking. The air was thick with a perfume so powerful it made his head throb, a sweetness that clung to the back of his throat, making it difficult to breathe. Elara led him to a bench in the center of the garden, a bench that seemed to be made of living wood, its branches twisting together to form a seat. She gestured for him to sit. "Do you like it?" she asked, her eyes scanning his face, looking for the cracks in his armor. "I have made this place into what you always wanted. Rich, productive, valuable." The Duke was silent. He was a man who lived for value, but he could not deny the feeling of dread that was coiling in his stomach. "It was a gift," he said, his voice strained, trying to reclaim the power he felt he was losing. "I am glad you have made such good use of it." She smiled again, but there was a coldness behind it now. "A gift. Is that what you call it? I call it a cage." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. "But I have turned the cage into a kingdom. And a kingdom has a price. Alistair, the land is happy now, but its happiness is not freed. It needs to be maintained. It needs to be fed." He stayed at Ashwood for a week. It was a week of torment. He could not sleep. The nights were filled with strange sounds. The skittering of things in the walls, the faint, rhythmic thumping from the fields, as if something was walking with a heavy, slow step through the crop rows. He began to have nightmares, nightmares of the forest. The Blackwood Forest, which he had barely noticed on his way in, now dominated his dreams. He dreamed of walking through the tangle, his feet sinking into the soft, decomposing earth, the branches reaching out to grab him, to pull him in. He dreamed of the circle of stones, and Elara was there, kneeling in the center, her hair streaming behind her as if blown by a wind that did not exist. She was speaking, but he could not hear the words. He only saw the soil beneath her begin to pulse, like a heartbeat. And then he saw something push its way out of the earth, something that was not a plant, something that had fingers. The villagers, too, had changed. They no longer watched him with silent suspicion. They now watched him with an unnerving familiarity, as if they knew his deepest secrets. They seemed taller, stronger. But their eyes were more distant, as if they were looking at him through a fog. They spoke to him in riddles, their voices echoing in the hollow spaces of his mind. They would ask him questions about his childhood, about his family, about things he had never told anyone. He felt as if his very essence was being dissected. And through it all, Elara watched him. She was a constant, reassuring presence, always there, always smiling that unsettling smile. She was feeding him. The food was incredible, more delicious than anything he had ever tasted. The meat was so tender it fell apart on his plate. The vegetables so flavorful they made his tongue ache with pleasure. But every time he took a bite, he felt a little more of his strength leave him. He was being fattened. He was being prepared. He just didn't know for what. The morning of his departure, he found Elara in the garden. She was kneeling, her hands buried in the dark earth, tending to a patch of black roses that she had been cultivating. They were the most beautiful roses he had ever seen, their petals like velvet, their scent a mixture of perfume and decay. She did not turn as he approached. "Leaving so soon, Alistair?" she asked, her voice soft. "I thought you might like to stay a little longer. There is so much more to see." The Duke's voice was trembling. "I have business to attend to in the capital. I'm afraid I cannot linger." She finally looked up, and her eyes, those vivid, glowing green eyes, fixed on his. "I see," she said. "Well then, I suppose I will have to content myself with the knowledge that you will be back. The land so enjoyed your company, it told me so. It has not had a guest in so long. It grows lonely." The Duke fled. He rode his horse through the village and out onto the main road without looking back. He could not bear to look back. He was a man who had seen the impossible, and it had shaken him to his core. He no longer saw his wife as a broken tool. He saw her as a threat, a powerful, terrifying threat. He was also furious she had defied him. She had not just survived, she had thrived. And in doing so, she had made him look a fool. The fear in his gut was quickly replaced by a familiar, burning hatred. He would not be defeated by a woman he had discarded. He would not allow his reputation to be soiled by a story of a remote, transformed duchy. He would find a way to undo her. He would find a way to put her back in her place. He would break her kingdom and return it to the ashes from whence it came. It never occurred to him, not in that moment, that the monster he was fighting was not a monster at all. It was the land itself, a land that had found a willing vessel in his abandoned wife. Back in London, the Duke began to plot. He consulted with lawyers, trying to find a legal loophole to reclaim the estate outright. He spread rumors about Elara's sanity, suggesting that she had lost her mind in the country, that she was a danger to herself and others. But he needed more than law. He needed leverage. He made a decision that would seal his doom. He chose to send an emissary, not a soldier, not a priest, but a man of science. He had heard of a Dr. Ambrose Crow, a man who traveled the country studying anomalies, natural wonders, and phenomena that defied conventional explanation. Crow was a rationalist, a man who believed that the world was a machine and that everything, no matter how strange, had a mechanical explanation. The Duke hired him, paying a small fortune for his services, with one simple instruction: go to Ashwood, find the source of Elara's power, and prove it is a fraud. Dr. Crow arrived in Ashwood in the autumn of 1787. He was a tall, gaunt man with spectacles that seemed too large for his face, and a mind that was a finely tuned engine of logic. He saw the transformed village, the impossible crops, and he was not impressed. He saw it as a puzzle to be solved. Elara greeted him with the same icy politeness she had shown her husband. She showed him the gardens, the fields, the village. She explained her methods, her use of soil science, her careful selection of seeds. Crow listened, taking copious notes, his pen scratching across the page. He did not believe her. There was a missing variable. He found a room to stay in the village, and he began to investigate. The villagers were of little help. They were evasive, their answers vague and unhelpful. They seemed to be protecting her, which Crow found strange and uncharacteristic of the peasantry. He began to notice the silence. It was a pervasive, heavy silence that settled over the land at dusk, a silence that was broken only by the sound of the wind and the slow, rhythmic pulse of something from the direction of the forest. He decided to investigate the forest himself. He took his lantern, his compass, and a small pistol, and he walked into the tangle. He walked for what felt like hours, the trees closing in around him, the path twisting and turning. He was looking for the anomaly, the source of the strange power he could feel in the air. A power that made his skin prickle and his hair stand on end. He never found the clearing. Instead, he found himself walking in circles, the same tree, the same gnarled root appearing over and over again. The forest was alive, and it was mocking him. He heard whispers, faint and mocking, calling his name. He ran, he fled the forest, his rational mind a shattered ruin of fear. When he returned to his room in the village, he found a small, intricately carved wooden box sitting on his pillow. He did not recognize it, but he knew with a sinking certainty who had left it. He opened it. Inside was a lock of hair, copper-colored. Elara's hair. And beneath it, a single sheet of paper with a message written in a fine, elegant script. There is no scientific explanation, Doctor. There is only the bargain. You have seen the forest. You have felt its heartbeat. The land is not a machine. It is a body, and I am its voice. Dr. Crow left Ashwood the following morning. He did not go to the Duke. He went to the church, to a remote monastery in the mountains, and he told the priests what he had seen. He told them about the black soil in the forest, about the circle of stones, about the feeling of being watched by something ancient and malevolent. He told them that the Lady of Ashwood was not a woman. She was a vessel, a conduit for a power that had been sleeping in the earth for centuries. The priests listened, their faces pale. They knew the legends. They knew about the blood that had been spilled on that soil long ago, the mass burial of a people who had been conquered and forgotten. They knew that the land had been steeped in sorrow and pain for so long that it had become sentient. And now that sentience had found a voice, it had found a soul to inhabit. The Duke, furious at Crow's failure and terrified by his fragmented report, decided to take matters into his own hands. He was a man of action, a man who had always gotten his way through force and intimidation. He raised a small force of armed men, mercenaries from the city, who had no loyalty to anyone but gold. His plan was simple. He would ride to Ashwood, he would confront Elara, and he would burn the manor to the ground. He would raze the fields. He would salt the earth. He would erase every trace of her transformation and claim that she had died in a tragic fire. It was the final, desperate act of a man who had lost control. The night before he was set to leave, he had a dream. He was back in Ashwood, but the village was not as he remembered it. The houses had grown, their walls melting into the earth, their roofs reaching for the sky like the branches of trees. The people were walking through the streets, but they were not walking. They were flowing, their bodies made of a thick, dark fluid that seemed to seep from the ground. They turned to him as one, and he saw that they had no faces. They were just masks of smooth, blank skin. And there, in the center of the nightmare, stood Elara. Her face was no longer the face he knew. It was a shifting mask, features melting and reforming, 100 different faces flashing across her features in the span of a single heartbeat. One of them was his mother. Another, his first love. Another, a child he had wronged and forgotten. Alistair, she said, and her voice was a chorus of screams. The bargain is not complete. You are the last piece. The Duke woke screaming, his body bathed in a cold sweat. The dream had felt so real. He could still smell the earth, the rot, the sweetness of the black roses. He told himself it was nothing but a nightmare brought on by stress. He was afraid, but he was also driven by a pride so monstrous that it overrode his fear. He could not let Elara win. He would not let her haunt him from beyond the grave. He would go to Ashwood and he would end it. The journey to Ashwood was a death march. The road, which had been difficult before, now seemed to red beneath his horse's hooves. The trees along the roadside leaned inward, their branches scraping at him like claws. The sky grew darker, a bruised, sickly yellow, and the air grew colder, biting at his skin with a supernatural chill. His men, hardened mercenaries, began to show signs of unease. They whispered among themselves, their eyes darting into the shadows of the forest. They spoke of feeling watched. They spoke of hearing footsteps behind them when no one was there. They began to regret taking the Duke's gold. They had not signed up for a war against ghosts. They arrived at the outskirts of Ashwood as the sun was setting, casting long, bloody shadows across the land. The village was there, but it was wrong. The houses were overgrown with vines, so thick they looked like they had been swallowed by the earth. The fields were not gold and green, but a deep, shimmering black, pulsating with a life that was not of this world. And the manor house was no longer a house. It had grown. It had grown impossibly, its walls stretching up into the sky, its windows blazing with a sickly green light. It was a fortress of the living earth. The Duke drew his sword, his hand trembling. He called out to his men to follow him to charge. But they did not move. They were frozen, their faces pale with terror. And then they started to scream. They dropped their weapons and fled, scattering into the woods, their cries of terror fading into the night. The Duke was alone. He was alone in the heart of a nightmare, and his enemy was coming. Elara walked out of the manor house. She was not walking. She was gliding, her feet not touching the ground. Her dress was no longer of green velvet. It was made of a living thing, a shifting pattern of leaves and moss, sewn together with spider silk. Her hair was a cascade of silver floating around her head as if she was underwater. Her eyes were no longer human. They were pits of emerald fire, burning with a primal, ancient intelligence. She was no longer the Lady Elara. She was something else. She was the Queen of the Hollow Earth, Alistair, she said, her voice a symphony of whispers that came from all around him, from the ground, from the air, from the screaming trees. You have come home. He tried to speak, but his tongue was paralyzed. He tried to lift his sword, but his arm was a dead weight. He was powerless. You wanted to break me. She continued, her gaze penetrating his soul. You wanted to make me a nothing. But you gave me this land. This land is not nothing. This land is an eternity. And you are not a lord, Alistair. You are a seed that I have been waiting to plant. He felt the ground beneath his feet shift. The soil parted, and he could feel roots, thick and pulsing with life, wrapping around his ankles, his calves, his thighs. He tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the earth. He was being pulled down, pulled into the dark, fertile soil. He looked up at Elara one last time, and he saw a single tear trace a silver path down her cheek. But it was not a tear of sorrow, it was a tear of completion. The land was starved, she whispered as the earth closed over his head, sealing him in the warm, damp embrace of the darkness. And you, my husband, are the feast. The Duke Alistair Vane vanished from history. His disappearance was a scandal for a brief time, a mystery that was whispered about in the clubs and drawing rooms of London. The truth was never discovered. The remaining estate, the Ashwood lands, were inherited by a distant cousin who was too afraid to ever visit the place. He sold the land for a pittance to a religious order, a reclusive group of monks who built a monastery on the edge of the Blackwood Forest. They were tasked with a singular, terrible duty to watch over the land, to ensure that nothing was ever planted there again, to keep the soil undisturbed. But the land is not something that can be silenced. It waits, it dreams. And the villagers who remained at Ashwood, the ones who saw what Elara became, they are not the same. They are the silent, dark-eyed people who sit on their porches in the twilight watching the forest, waiting. They have become part of the land's dream. Their blood is in the soil. Their souls are in the roots. They are guardians, but they are also prisoners. They hear the heartbeat of the land, the slow, steady pulse that comes from deep within the earth, and they know that their lady is not gone. She is just sleeping. Her roots spread throughout the entire duchy now, her consciousness a part of the very air they breathe. The land is her body, and she is slowly, patiently reaching out. The monks built their walls high. They pray ceaselessly. They chant their psalms and burn their incense, trying to drown out the whispers that seep through the stone. They have tried to exorcise the land, to bless it, to reclaim it for God. But their prayers are devoured by the forest, by the silence, by the smell of the black roses that now bloom on the edge of the village every spring, despite the fact that no one planted them. The monastery is a prison of faith, a thin dam against an ocean of ancient chthonic power. On the rare occasions that a lost traveler wanders into the valley of Ashwood, they tell stories of a woman in a green dress who appears at the edge of the forest. She does not speak. She simply points, and those who follow her finger see a patch of ground that is unnaturally dark, a piece of earth that seems to breathe, a soil so rich and black that it looks like it is alive with a wraithing internal light. The traveler's guide will usually cross himself, mumble an apology to the land, and pull the stranger away, dragging them back down the road, warning them never to return. But the warnings do not always work. Some are drawn by the beauty of the valley. They see the lush fields, the vibrant colors, the impossible blooms. They see the Blackwood Forest, not as a nightmare, but as a mystery. They enter the valley seeking a peace that does not exist, thinking they can harvest the riches of the land. They are fools. The land is always hungry. The land has a taste for the blood of men. And the lady, the beautiful, terrible lady Elara, is always patient. She waits for those who will not be warned, who think they can take her prize without paying the price. She finds them in the night when they are alone, when the mist is thick and the world is silent. She comes to them not as a monster, but as a vision of beauty, offering them the keys to the kingdom, a taste of the forbidden fruit, and they accept. The mysterious disappearances in the region around Ashwood are never connected. They are written off as wanderlust, as accidents, as the vagaries of fate. But the monks know, the villagers know, they know that the land is a body, a living, breathing, sentient entity that has a will of its own, and its will is to grow, to spread, to consume. It is slowly, infinitesimally expanding. The forest creeps a little further each year. The black soil is spreading, leaching into the pastures beyond the monastery walls, turning the green grass to a dark, wet velvet. The transformation has begun. You might think this is a story of a woman scorned. You might think it is a ghost story. But it is something far more terrifying. It is a story of a fundamental law of nature being broken. A law that says the land is ours to use, ours to dominate. Elara discovered the truth. The land is not ours. We are the land's. We are seeds planted in its soil, destined to wither and become part of its cycle. And when the cycle is broken, when the land is starved, it will find a way to reclaim what is its due. The power that Elara touched is the oldest power of all, the power of the earth, the power of the bones. She did not create the darkness. She simply gave it a voice. She gave it a face. The face of a woman, beautiful and terrible, a symbol of a hunger that cannot be sated. She is the architecture of the earth's pain, a monument to a life that was taken, a justice that was denied. And as long as the soil of Ashwood remains undisturbed, she will be there, waiting, dreaming, growing. So the next time you find yourself walking through a patch of woods that is too quiet, a field that seems to be too green, a patch of soil that seems unnaturally dark and rich, you must remember this story. You must remember the Lady of Ashwood. And you must ask yourself, is the land around me alive? Is it watching me? Is it waiting for me to make a mistake? Because if it is not the light you should be afraid of. It is the darkness beneath your feet. It is the hunger that lives in the earth. It is the promise that the land made to Elara Vane, a promise that she fulfilled with a fury that would make the devil himself weep. This is why the old houses in the village of Ashwood are always empty. The villagers know not to sleep indoors. They have seen the roots, the way they wreathe at night, seeking the warmth of a body, the rhythm of a heartbeat. They sleep in the open, in the market square, so that the land cannot reach them as easily. They live a life of fear, whispering the old prayers, their eyes fixed on the horizon. They are waiting for the seal to break. They are waiting for the lady to rise. And perhaps one day she will. She will not just walk out of the Blackwood Forest. She will erupt from the earth itself. The soil will split, and she will emerge not as a woman, but as a colossus of root and leaf and dark, bloody sap. Her eyes will be the emerald fire of a million leaves, burning in the sun, and her voice will be the roar of the wind through a hollow, ancient grove. She will be the queen of the world, ruling from a throne of twisted skeletal roots with the souls of men as her subjects. She will transform the world not into a garden, but into a beautiful, terrible, never-ending forest, where the trees are the bones of the unjust and the soil is fed by the blood of the guilty. And all will have started in a moment of heartbreak, a moment of betrayal, a moment when a man chose to discard a woman into the wilderness, not knowing that the wilderness was waiting for her, yearning for her, and would turn her into the very vengeance that would one day consume him. The story of Duke Alistair Vane is a lesson, a warning, a whispered prayer in the dark. It is a reminder that the things we cast aside have a way of taking root, that the people we wrong will find a way to grow, to spread, to consume us from the inside out. The Duke banished his wife to the countryside, hoping to make her a forgotten shadow. He did not realize he was planting the first seed of his own annihilation. He gave her a land that was barren and broken, and she turned it into a kingdom of the damned. He thought he was burying his shame, but he was only nourishing it. Listen. Do you hear it? The sound of the soil shifting, stretching, dreaming. It is the sound of the lady's garden growing, creeping closer. She does not forgive. She only waits. And she is very, very patient now. The mist is rolling in. The gray shroud is descending. The light is fading from the sky, and the shadows are lengthening, reaching out with fingers of charcoal and ash. The night is here, and the land is awake. The Lady of Ashwood is watching, her eyes fixed on the world. She will one day claim she is not a ghost, she is not a demon, she is the earth itself, and she is hungry. As you sit in the safety of your home, you might feel a sudden chill, a draft, a shadow that moves just a little too quickly in the corner of your eye. You might dismiss it as a trick of the light, the wind, your imagination. But remember, the land is everywhere. It is under your feet, in the walls of your house, in the roots of the trees outside your window. It listens, it waits, it dreams. What do you think happened to those who stayed? What do you think became of the villagers who chose to remain as part of the land's eternal feast? Their story is not over, it is just beginning. And perhaps, in a way, their story is your story too. The lady is rising, and she is not only in the woods, she is in the soil. She is in the silence. She is in the terrible, patient dark. The floorboards in your room are creaking. Do you hear them? The roots are stirring. I wonder, what are you planting in your own soil? Comment below. She is listening.